Oh.
Thank you. I am your chair for this session. So my name is Anna Longley. I'm from the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. This session was to be 3 papers on organisational perspectives on not-for-profits. Unfortunately, we are down a speaker today. So when we get to Susan's, I just might make a comment or two about the synopsis, which of course you already have in the conference guide anyway. But to start, I would like to welcome Professor Kirsten Holmes and also James Wild up to talk about Is a Thriving Shed a Happy Shed? Thanks.
So, thanks very much. Just want to briefly introduce ourselves. So you can see we've got quite a large team of researchers working on this. So I'm at Curtin University and I'm one of the academics working along with my other colleagues, Professor Peter McAvoy, who's the other lead, and our colleagues there. And James Wild is the CEO of Men's Shed of WA. And we've been working with him and his team on this project. So the aim of it is to look at the really evaluating the impact of men's sheds, and particularly a focus on Men's Shed of WA, although it is a national and international movement. And James is going to give a bit of an introduction. So
thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As Kirsten said, I'm James Wild. I'm the CEO of Men's Shed of WA. Men's Shed of WA is the peak body for sheds across the state, of which there are now over 180 men's sheds and community sheds in the state, representing over 7,000 people attending those sheds. That's the indirect community-based support. We're a peak body, so we're supported by government, supported by federal government and state government to offer that connection between government and the community organisations, but also to offer direct support into the shed. They are volunteer-led organisations. We provide government support, funding support, grants, to ensure that they've got the capacity and capability to do the job they need to do. So, for those that aren't aware, what is a men's shed? What is a community shed? They are fast growing. There's more men's sheds in Australia than there are McDonald's, so which is a good thing. Over 1,000 men's sheds across Australia. So they're really finding the purpose, picking the purpose in Australia, and that's really wrapped around community support, community delivery. They're involved in whether it's local individual projects or local government projects. They support a whole range of initiatives creating and managing nature play areas, environmental maintenance, and clean-ups in the areas, for the support for our sheds that build bubble benches to help combat loneliness in farming schools. It's a whole array of community projects that we're involved in. But the core of many sheds is the principle of men's health and well-being. The sheds are there to combat social isolation and loneliness. That's really the crux of why they become so successful. They do that in 2 ways. The sheds have a direct line of sight into health and well-being, so they will provide a well-being health officer for their members. They provide workshops themselves and bring speakers in. So they have a very direct approach to well-being. But the main benefit from sheds is what we term health lifestyle. It's the very nature of the shed being there, the fact that they can provide an opportunity for particularly older age men, vulnerable men, come together, share life experiences, share stories, and feel that they are part of the community is something that really works. And they are a tool in themselves to combat social isolation and loneliness. Parts of what we do in Men's Shed, the parts of Men's Shed that we actually say, we need a better understanding of what makes a shed successful. What makes a shed thrive? We represent the regional smaller sheds, the larger metro sheds that have 300 we wanted a better understanding of what success means. And also conversely, when sheds aren't successful, they are struggling, not why are those sheds struggling. So we were fortunate to engage bringing some North West funding to bring 13 universities out as a research partner to help us get to the real core understanding of what makes a shed a thriving shed. So that's not in terms of monetary value, that's in terms of what it brings to the community. Hopefully, this will help us to influence policy. It will help us to not just amend it, but all the community have a seat at the table with government where we can say, if we are looking at supporting newly established and developed nuclear communities in your area, these are some of the mechanisms and advantages and the points that you should be looking at for those organisations and how best to fund them or how best to support them. So that's kind of a very quick snapshot. I've not taken too much time. I'll hand over to Kirsten to talk a bit more about the project.
So, as you've heard, our aim was to try and establish what makes a thriving shed. So we thought about what are some of the factors that might come towards this. So it could be the governance, the location, maybe that has an impact where it's located, both in terms of its sort of physical location, but also is it rural or regional or metropolitan? What kind of networks the shed might have, its size, the kinds of members it has, the kinds of activities, and there might be some others. So we started off by conducting a systematic literature review, and we identified that there were three key factors that came out of the literature. The first was about the funding, which is probably, we could talk more broadly about that, referring to the resources. And it's about the difficulties that sheds have in accessing the funds to run the shed and do the activities that their members want to engage in. But it's also about the lack of funding, which places unnecessary pressure on the members themselves to sort of build products and sell those products to raise funds and engage in other kinds of fundraising activities to keep the shed going. So having enough funding was really important, and it was mentioned across some studies. The men's shed movement is global. It's not in every country, but there were studies in Australia, Scotland, New Zealand, and Ireland, which all identified the funding as an important issue. So if the shed wasn't self-funding, if the shed had enough funding from, say, government or another source, then it didn't put that pressure on the members, and that was seen to sort of reduce the stress and be a little bit happier and report a little bit better well-being. So, and there was also a study which highlighted how the lack of that funding problem impacted on the comradeship between the members, that it sort of made it a little bit more cohesive if they didn't have to worry about that funding. So the funding came out as one thing that was particularly important. The second one that came out was about governance and support. So it talked about the type of leadership, so the quality and style of leadership of the shed coordinators, which in almost all sheds are volunteers, they're members that form a committee and they run the shed. So it is very much mutual aid, members running it for members' benefit. So, and that relationship between those shed leaders and the members came up as an important factor. So having a strong quality leader-member relationship was associated with greater social connectedness and health and well-being among the members. But also lack of support from coordinators and a more authoritative leadership within the shed was associated as having a negative impact on those factors. So that was obviously quite important. And then the third factor that came out of the literature was the physical structure. Around the time. So this was about the physical features of the building. Does it have a social area for people to collect in, as well as workshop space? So given the activities that James has talked about that men's sheds deliver, a lot of it's around workshops, woodwork, metalwork, but also other kinds of activities using a garden space. But also the physical location. So, there's one study that talked about the shed being in a not particularly pleasant part of town, and members felt quite stressed actually going there to where it was located. So yeah, the importance of having a social area, the ease of access, and the safety of the building came out as key factors. So that was from a literature review. So we then conducted 2 forms of primary research. So that's a sort of summary of the methods that we put together. So we did the systematic literature review. Then we've run an online survey to members of all the sheds in Western Australia. And we're running it in 3 waves. So we've run the first wave where we had 333 men's shed members. And they were asked a lot of different questions about their health and well-being and different questions about the shed, about its governance, the activities that they did. But we also asked them, is your shed a happy shed? And we gave that a like-it rating out of 5. So we calculated all the mean scores for the sheds that responded. And the highest and lowest scoring sheds were invited to participate in these interviews because we wanted to get an idea of what's a happy shed, what are the factors in a happy shed, and what are the factors in maybe a not so happy shed. Now, generally the mean was 4.25. So overall, most sheds were happy. So it was only a small number that we kind of identified were what we might call sheds in need of support. And we wanted to kind of unpack that and find out a bit more. So we then conducted these interviews. We've done a total of 14 interviews with different men's sheds. They were about half an hour to just over an hour. And they were all done online because we were doing this during the COVID problem and because we were doing some in some more remote areas as well of WA. Plus, as you all know, if you use Teams, you can record it and transcribe it, and it's nice and helpful, which is very good. And then we use template analysis to interview the data that we've got today. So I'll just tell you a little bit about sheds in the sample. Now, this is actually, James is probably quite, maybe not so happy with this map, I don't know. It's a very old map because it's from 2013. And it was the only map I could find, which is why I've used it. And I wanted to just use this to illustrate how we're looking at WA, but you can see that there's men's sheds all over Australia. There's a lot of them. And back in 2013, so there don't seem to be too many in WA at the time, but there's 180 now, as James has just said. So you can imagine that they've grown as well in the other states too. And we know that a number of other states are involved in research with their men's shed associations. So it's obviously important as a movement there. So of those 14 sheds, we had a mix of metropolitan, some large regional towns and some small regional towns. They were hugely varied, so they ranged in size from 25 to 250 members, huge variation, and also in age from very new, only 2 years old, through to 16 years, which is probably one of the older sheds in WA. So, and the activities most commonly they're involved in were woodwork, followed by metalwork, but they're also beekeeping. Beekeeping is quite popular. Gardening, photography, cookery, walking groups, and 2 of the sheds included women as members, as well as men. One of the sheds, women aren't members, but they have another women's shed that meets on that site. So it's a separate organisation, but it meets on the same site and uses the same shed. So what were the key themes that came out of this? Well, physical structure came out as really important. There were a mix of purpose-built and adapted buildings. And one of the biggest, this was really related to funding as well, because one of the biggest funding drives was making changes to the building, extending it, particularly storage space. There were a lot of sheds putting in a mezzanine floor to store things. So a lot of them needed this more space. And some of them shared with other groups, and some, the building was theirs, but they let other groups use it as well. And sometimes they charged them for this, and sometimes they didn't. And it was interesting when I talked about why they charged it, they said, well, then that means that they can't believe that they co-own the building because they have to pay to use it. So it's interesting seeing what kind of went underneath that. Now, only a percentage of the membership used the shed regularly. And that was one of the things we talked about was how many members have you got, how many use it regularly? And then as a measure of really how big the shed is, because they would all tell me it's this number of meters by this number of meters. But what really mattered to me was how many members can you fit in at any one time into your building. And some of them couldn't fit very many. And while nearly all the sheds were accepting new members, one shed leader said they weren't because they didn't think they could serve all the members they already had. They hadn't got enough space in the shed for all those members to come in. But one of the key points they talked about was the council relationship being really important in terms of getting a good building, getting a good site. And I was told the first thing any new shed needs to do is go and talk to their local council and build a relationship there. And there was a real mix of the quality of the relationships with the local councils. So the other point that came out was funding. Very diverse sources of funding. They all charge membership fees, but that's often quite a small amount. It doesn't necessarily cover their costs. They were all really good at applying for grants. And a lot of the sheds had a specific grants person who applied for their grants. Generally, someone who had a bit of experience in that area, maybe they have a financial background, they know how to fill in a grant form, but they were getting a lot of grants from some really interesting sources, which I have to say I was jotting down some because I was thinking, oh, might be able to get one from Department of Gaming, apparently. WA Department of Gaming has leftover money that they who knew? Giving it out to them all, but it used to be. Yeah. So, but equally, they talked about, and I know this is common with other associations, the red tape around some types of grants, and that you fill it in and then it comes back and says you haven't done this and you haven't done this, and that they come back, the council would come back to them on the day of the deadline and say, oh, but you haven't provided a survey. Like, well, obviously we're not going to get a survey by your deadline, so we're out of this. While the literature talked about the requirement to make items to sell and how this had negative impact, most of the sheds were not relying on selling items. And in fact, they often said that their members weren't very good at selling. So they book a farmer's market stall and turn up and like no one would actually sell anything because they just weren't interested really in doing the sales pitch. So a lot of them sold goods, but they would put them on their Facebook page. You know, it wasn't a very aggressive type of fundraising. But they were really good at other kinds of fundraising. So one that those of you outside of WA might, I don't know if you have this, Containers for Change, which is where you bring in your containers. So a lot of them were their local areas Containers for Change collector, and everyone from the local area would drop off there. And they were making a lot of money. I had no idea you can make that much money out of Containers for Change, but they were making several $1,000s out of Containers for Change, which was quite impressive. And they got a lot of donations, house clearances. People would phone up and say, we've got all these old tools. And they typically would sell them on. They don't use them themselves. They sell on those kinds of things. So that was it about the funding, just really entrepreneurial in terms of their funding. Another point that came out was the networks and the importance of that. And, you know, some of them had some really key people involved in their shed. So one fairly new shed has got I think they've got one of the managers, general managers from Bunnings is a member of their shed. That's very convenient when you're a woodwork kind of organisation that needs lots of tools and wood and things. And another had a member who owned a demolition company. So when they needed a new kitchen, he just gave them a kitchen he'd taken out, which is, again, very convenient. But what also came out as really important was, particularly for the more regional and rural sheds, was their role in the community and acting as a community hub. So, you know, their building would host various other groups that came in when they needed a building occasionally. There was one group that would do things like they'd do breakfast every so often. If there was an event coming through their town, they would do breakfast for everyone on that event and they'd stop off and have a breakfast there. So that kind of role in the community, I think, is really important and probably not very well known, I would think. And then governance, which was the third point that came out of the literature. So the shed leaders talked about how they tried to get the balance right between having the right atmosphere and getting things done. It was a real kind of trade-off between those two things, with one shed leader commenting, I'm not an empire builder, I'm just here to serve the members. And that they would be willing to drop a proposed change if it made their members feel uncomfortable. So making the members feel comfortable was the priority. And I think that really aligns with the sort of aim of men's sheds about looking after men's health and well-being, and that came first rather than, you know, changing the membership or doing new activities, that kind of thing. That was the focus. One of the problems they have, which a lot of voluntary associations have, is around getting people to take on those committee roles. So, you know, they would comment, it's always the same people on the committee and cleaning up and doing stuff like washing the towels and vacuuming the floor. And This was particularly a problem in more rural areas where you've got a limited pool of potential leaders within the community. So I would talk to shed leaders and they said, well, I had to stand down because I was asked to be the leader of this club instead. And so I had to go and do something else. So there's a sort of limited role there, but also health. Primarily these are older men. The whole organisation is designed to improve their health, but inevitably there are health problems which come along and mean that people have to step down from those kind of roles of responsibility for various reasons. The last point that came out of the materials we looked at was how they supported their members. All of the sheds, except one, had a stable or increasing membership base, but there was concern about the age profile as members and how to attract younger members. So one of the shed leaders commented that there was a general perception that you needed to be old, but not too old to become a member of the men's sheds. In addition to that, the shed leaders seem to be really aware of having this pastoral role of looking after, in a sense, their members, which was interesting. So, they would keep a register of attendees, and if someone who regularly came in didn't come in, they'd phone them up and find out why aren't, what's going on? Are you okay? But they said that although they felt that that was important, they were it was hard for them to know who should be doing that in the shed. How do we do this? That was one of the challenges. And they also, in addition to all of the woodwork, the kind of classic activities, they ran a lot of activities to sort of help their members live independent lives, which, for example, they said we've got to teach, make sure that our members know how to cook a good meal, because particularly if they've got members who are widowed or have become divorced and are having to live on their own. So teaching them how to cook and also how to clean up after they've cooked, and running courses on online banking, because especially in these rural areas, all the banks are closing down. So they're having to, do this online. So I thought that was a really interesting way in which they were trying to support their members, their well-being in a very broad sense. So in conclusion, I've just pulled out what we see as what came out as the key challenges and what were the success factors, because we're still pulling this together. So in terms of the challenges, we're often the physical constraints of the building. They can only have so many people in at a time. They're struggling with storage. Some of the buildings aren't necessarily ideal or in ideal locations. And also recruiting more members to help out and volunteer, which is an ongoing thing. And Zach's going to lead us with that through the National Volunteering Strategy. But in terms of the success, I think their networks and their role in the community were really important. And the way that they drew on those networks to get what they needed done. I was really impressed by what I call their entrepreneurship, their ability to find quite large amounts of funding from a range of sources. I think they've been pretty successful with that. I think their role as community centres, I think that's something that, could do, I think can make a lot more of that. I think that's a really valuable role there. And the way that they support their members outside of just providing I guess the more leisurely type activities, but the way that they're sort of providing extra support and help to their members. And I put inclusivity because I think they were pretty inclusive, but this is obviously a contradiction with the fact that not many of them have women. And a couple of the sheds had voted against having women as members. So it's a bit of a contradiction. So I think they try very hard to be inclusive. Sheds talked about, if someone's passing through, we had someone passing through, they wanted to fix their van, and we're very happy for them to just come along for a few weeks and fix their van. So there's that kind of welcoming inclusiveness, and yet at the same time maintaining their kind of status quo as well. So I think that's something that maybe sheds are working on as they go forward as to what they want their membership base to look like. So that's our summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, both to Kirsten and James. So, yes, I understand the point around inclusivity. One of the limitations, perhaps, is their governing documents, the fact that they're registered charities for some of them in terms of that inclusivity. So we're moving on to our next presentation. So I'd like to welcome Belinda Luke, who's talking about who's developing the development organisations, an examination of grassroots NGOs' capabilities and needs. Thanks.
All right, hi everyone. This is a paper that has been written by Rowena, who is a Masters of Philosophy student, and myself. Rowena is from Papua New Guinea, and I lived in Papua New Guinea for a couple of years. And so what we were focusing on is, development organisations, and you're looking at the chain of NGOs from international to national to local, but maybe the cracks or the chips in those chains, and what could be perhaps done more effectively. So for anyone who's not familiar with PNG, it's an absolutely beautiful country, but certainly a developing country. Eye-opening context in terms of tribal, the differences, the terrain. 1 hour flight from Cairns, but I would say it's almost a different world, and with very different worldviews on what's kind of acceptable social norms. So NGOs, of course, play an important part in development in terms of the giving and receiving funds when we talk about the different levels of NGOs and overseeing the development services. But what our focus was on was the grassroots NGOs or community-based organisations. So I'm not sure if there's a difference. I can't see one necessarily, and I'm not sure which is the better term, but typically, very small organisations established by local people to help local people. And the benefit, or one of the strengths of CBOs is the strong understanding of local context. But a common criticism is or concern is the very limited financial resources, which I guess ties into what we've been hearing about this morning and last night. So definitely important CBOs in PNG are important actors in development. And when we talk about capacity constraints, it's normally linked to financial management. And so we, rather than saying, okay, well, we believe financial management is the problem, we kind of just took a step gently in to examine, well, what capabilities do CBOs have and what capabilities do CBOs need, rather than taking an express focus on the financial. And so we looked at 3 different community-based organisations in 3 different regions of Papua New Guinea. And of course, what we started to do is also then look at 2 donor organisations that were linked with those 3 different CBOs and start to, examine the relationships, because obviously there's multiple relationships with their clients or beneficiaries, but then upward to their funders and upward to those people's funders further. So, looking at what networks of relationships were going well and maybe which ones, needed to be reviewed. So PNG, a country of 8 million people, but there's 1,000 ethnic tribes speaking over 800 different languages, and you only need to go over another hill to see another group of people who've never seen the others work on the other side of the hill. It's a crazy, it's absolutely beautiful, but it's a crazy situation. Rich in natural resources, in mining, oil and gas in particular, and my background was actually working for an accounting firm which served the mining or worked a lot with the mining industry there, so we used to get helicopters to work kind of thing. High levels of poverty though, unfortunately, and with low levels of human development, and that's kind of compounded by poor law and order and high levels of corruption. So their position on the corruption perception index is not great. So barriers to development and development organisations is geography and just physically accessing remote locations, but also different cultural practices and different languages. And so while there is a commonality of Melanesian culture and this idea of Wantop, which is your extended unofficial family, so social ties are important, and reciprocity in terms of give and take, certainly within individual areas, there are quite distinct and different cultural norms. So the economy itself has been driven a lot by foreign aid. So an overseas development assistance is recently focused specifically on education, health and gender equality. And so they were kind of overlapping with the focus of the CBOs that we went in and had a look at, or that Rowena engaged with. Definitely, you know, within the literature and within practice, the concept of partnerships is really important. But they're often talked about, you know, partnerships as in funding arrangements. But really, what was interesting to us is those partnerships weren't limited to money. They needed to go beyond money, and certainly on the ground, you know, it wasn't limited to money. But the conversation changed in terms of what capital was being transferred or considered as we went down that chain, effectively that supply chain, from international to national to local. So that's what we also then started to look at, is, you know, just a better understanding of these relationships and how those relationships might, if they were more effective, you know, might produce better outcomes. So CBOs, you know, their experience and awareness of local context and development issues was widely acknowledged as just what was so valuable about them. But as I said before, that criticism about lack of financial management capabilities, again, that was kind of just a really broadly accepted concept. And of course, you know, they need to have minimum standards of record keeping and responsibility and a little bit of a track record to receive funding. But they also then need to comply with or satisfy quite stringent and individual requirements set by individual donors. So it was kind of, as a small team on the ground, you know, providing the service that you're wanting to, but then B, get your head around each individual donor's financial reporting requirements, which took quite a long time for them to do that. And particularly because their focus, or their reality, was project-based, so short-term contracts and funding, where, you know, there's this underlying discussion about, oh, we want them to be sustainable, we want them to carry on by themselves, but actually they were very short-term relationships. So there's kind of two disconnected conversations going here, or two conversations that weren't very easy to reconcile. So for CBOs, they were very aware that sometimes these were going to be quite short-term relationships, but yet they needed to figure out how they were going to get access to long-term resources. So they were the kind of the issues they were concerned about. So yeah, in terms of capital lens, we talked about capabilities, but then we started to really look at this through a capital lens, because, you know, everyone talks about financial capital as the funds that we're passing on, and there was a very strong acceptance that social capital was exactly what CBOs had, that give them the money and they've got the social capital to work, you know, to do what's needed on the ground with different community groups. So there was language around, you know, the social relations and the bonding and the bridging. And there was an acceptance that, you know, those people could make connections that would take far longer and far much more money and time for outsiders to make. So financial management, financial capital is what they saw being passed down, and social capital is what they were relying on to work. And so it was very much this traditional model of, we provide financial capital, you leverage your social capital, and that's how the arrangements work. But what we kind of went in then and had a look at is, well, maybe there is a gap, because if CBOs need skill development and just a little bit of maybe financial management skills, where's the intellectual capital? Where's the way for them to be more upskilled, to be more comfortable about being sustainable organisations? So, you know, capacity building in the literature, it's certainly there, but it's typically considered from an end user, a beneficiary perspective. You know, we talk about those people receiving the services, but nobody seems to talk about that as in terms of the organisations along the supply chain, for want of a better term. And I think for community-based organisations, that's exactly what we were looking at. So yeah, there's an expectation of quality services, and, you know, that people will benefit from those services, but we need, you know, nobody was actually spending time or money to develop CBOs capacity building themselves. And so that's exactly what we kind of looked at to see, could there be a different approach to this? So our method was interpretivism mainly, and constructivism, and we took a qualitative approach, and Rowena is from creative industries. I'm an accounting background, so I did not really have any creative aspect to my being. But she wanted to do observations and interviews, which is absolutely fine. But she also wanted to do creative workshops. So she carried out 1- and 2-day workshops in different regions with the community-based organisations. So there was drama and role play and imagery, which for me as an accountant, where my data collection often stops at interviews and observation, that was a really interesting aspect. And so what she was, very focused on was establishing a safe place or space where, they could explore the sensitive, maybe tenuous issues about donor relationships. And it's exactly what we're hearing this morning. You want a good relationship with the funders, but actually you want to challenge the things that need to be challenged or voice the concerns that need to be voiced. So those 3 CBOs that we looked at, gender, violence and human rights issues, and they'd each been operating for more than 20 years. So there was a number of interviews done with management and staff, community partners, so those people who weren't officially employees but certainly engaged and helped with service provision, and then observation and workshops, so 2 workshops over a 3-day period. But I think what was nice about this study is we then went to the donors that fund those organisations, so we're kind of hearing from 2 perspectives. And they'd had, again, long-term relationships, worked for more than 10 years with those CBOs. And so we did interviews with 7 of their management and staff. So the case studies, it was about, from that there was mapping in terms of process mapping, what actually happens, inspiration mapping of, what they saw as their reality, but what they want their reality to be in the future. So imagery became a really interesting part of the data as well. And then, of course, the emotional reasons behind the behaviour. So unpacking why they were communicating the issues or seeing things as they saw them and getting to their experiences. So that led to thematic analysis and looking at just, the relationship between CBOs and donors, initially based on capabilities, but then kind of reframed through capital, because I think it's so easy to default to this capital lens, but maybe it just needs to be drawn out a little bit further. So that was provided by donors, developed within CBOs, and needed by CBOs. So just linking back to, what do they have, but what don't they have and they actually need. So CBO 1 was established when a woman in an eastern province suffered from gender-based violence and established a safe house. And she said, I want the girls of tomorrow to be able to walk down the street without being harassed. The second was when 3 women from enemy tribes wanted peace. So we'd seen fathers and brothers going off to fight, and some of them not always coming home, and we just had enough of it, so over generations. And the last one, again, woman established by women who were survivors of gender-based violence. And so in terms of the operational or program capabilities and challenges, there was very much shared understanding that CBOs were best placed. They know their area, their space, they've got those relationships. And so there was an emphasis on, otherwise we'd spend a year trying to get the local community just to trust you before you commence the program. So social capital as CBO's strength very much came through. They had the network, but I think there was this real sense of belonging as well. They belong to that place, that location, and it belongs to the people. So that was, that was clearly what they did value within CBOs. And the CBOs themselves, they said, we don't just go in and talk immediately about violence. We talk about the positive things first that men can contribute to the community, and then we broach the issues of, how violence is a negative effect on everyone. So there was this real, there were key things about relational trust, bonding with communities, bridging social gaps and divides that, they weren't always welcomed into another community, even though they were local Papua New Guineans, they weren't local to each individual community. And so, they often said, we'll come into a community and we might teach them screen printing, or we'll give them resources in terms of, and teach them about earning an income. And next time we come back, they're interested to hear what we want to talk about. So we're coming on their terms, and then we come in hopefully to bridge the two together. and using social networks. So, there was a real sense that they've come a long way, that the community knows us and the community trusts us. So definitely this is all speaking to aspects of social capital. So CBO's strengths, exactly what we just talked about, and the impacts of CBO. The problem was the impacts of CBO's work was not always visible to outsiders. And that was particularly reflected in the costs that while they would put in budgets, sometimes the items in the budget were removed. They said, we want you to deliver the program, but these costs are just unnecessary. Whereas the local organisations are saying, actually, they are necessary. They won't just let us in, even if we look like them. We're not part of the community until we buy into the community's values. So, there was a concern that there's not an appreciation always of the financial aspects. And yet there wasn't any concerns about their financial management skills. So they were meeting the requirements, and they were doing the record keeping, and there wasn't anything overly sophisticated, but it was completely adequate. So it kind of made us question, well, this big concern in the literature didn't actually seem to be the concern on the ground. So there was an appreciation that, that they're survivors themselves. They know how to run an organisation, but they probably couldn't do anything too much bigger on a larger scale. And the comment was that there was one CBO that we didn't interview, and the funders said, oh, those guys are outliers. They've got powerful books, they know what they're doing, they're registered CPAs, and certified practicing accountant, but that was considered very much not the norm. And yet, while they didn't necessarily have exactly the same skill sets, we didn't see a huge difference in what was delivered in terms of financial capability. And while CBOs met donors' requirements, there was this developing dependency on them, which again, I guess, links back to what we've been hearing about, that the social capital is working, the financial capital is working to some extent, but there was no intellectual capital development. We'd love to build their capacity, but we just don't have time. So it wasn't immediately a costing issue, and yet time is money in a sense. So there was an allocation of resources that had to go to that. But to us, that seemed like the gap in the conversation, that it's easier just to tell them exactly what we want, only approve, and limit it to what we've all agreed on. And so, in a sense, CBOs were a little bit constrained in how they could develop as an organisation. And so, if anything, to us, whether you look at it through a capital lens or whether you look at it through a capability lens, it's quite interesting that there's this agreement about the financial capital, there's this acceptance of the social capital, but nobody really wanted to talk about intellectual, and you didn't even need to say the words intellectual capital. But that was, to us, the area that wasn't being addressed. And maybe that's the conversation that needs to be had or reframed. And again, you could talk about it in terms of capabilities, which they were far more familiar with, that actually the financial capabilities were okay and the financial support was there to some extent. But it was the organisational development, again, that same issue just looked at through a slightly different lens was the one that was missing. And so, I guess, traditionally, donors are all about providing the financial capital, and CBOs, they're framed as having the social capital, but it's that middle or that extra organisational capital, the capacity building, the intellectual capital, that seems to be missing from the conversation, and we thought that was probably something that it is actually needing to be expressly discussed. It is briefly mentioned in the literature. We did find a reference to it, but certainly not widely, or it didn't seem to us to be widely there. So, while this is only 3 community-based organisations, we did think that it raised some nice issues and nice insights. And, I guess maybe it's about having similar conversations, but in a slightly different language to make people look at the issue or appreciate it in a slightly different way. So.
I think this is a very useful slide just to keep up generally. Thank you. It's like I've prepared it earlier. As I said at the outset, unfortunately, Susan is unable to present to us today. And Susan Pizzati was going to speak about the pressure that not-for-profit organisations are under to remain fit for purpose in the face of increasingly complex operating environments, and the challenges that it poses for not-for-profit leaders, their operational structures and systems as well. And so I think we've probably heard, I would say, particularly in Belinda's presentation, really what some of those complexities are, and same as when we're talking about men's sheds as well, the need for really good leadership and the need for really for different skill sets to lead organisations at varying levels and varying scales. So I think that would have been a lovely paper to round out that little set, and I can definitely see why the three of them were put together. But I do welcome questions for the people we do have with us today and who very helpfully presented to us. So Belinda and Kirsten and also James, of course, I'm sure, are happy to answer questions that you have. Murray.
James, thanks for your contribution. I noticed that the wind sheds were given tax deductibility DGR status in just last year. Did you notice any change in resources as a result of that? The federal government said it cost them $8 million to give you tax deductibility. I'm not sure why it did, but that's what the federal government says was lost revenue. And perhaps it begs the question, why didn't you have that prior to that, given the good that you were doing in the community? On those two issues.
Yeah, really good question. I think in terms of DGR status, has it changed? You mentioned it. I don't think it's any regular. The organisation didn't mention status, well-being, the larger shares, the ones with the capacity, the ones with the network, the know-how, the organisational structure, you're able to capitalise on it. The smaller sheds, they would come to either delay or development stage, federal body, where we could manage donations on their behalf. That still happens, that's still a place. Particularly when they are volunteer-led, delegation from some of those sheds to take on that responsibility. The concern of the sheds is that that's a specific one. Also, for DGR, the model sheds they do into the quality by that service. So has it changed? Has it changed possibly in the second part? Have I answered that?
Well, the second part really was, what's the difference? You were a community-based men's health body beforehand. You couldn't get DGR, and then suddenly the government said, well, we give it to you. Just wondering why it was necessary to get this special payment.
Yeah, but to be honest, I think it's something the federal body can push for. Give sheds the capacity to fight the DGR states if they want to. It's never a restriction. It's still able to access all the funds. There's always the mechanism. The only thing that will change, I think, is some of that capacity building will use some of the sheds to go outside of their membership. Those are community leadership. They can manage some of these things.
Yeah, I think from an ACNC point of view, the influx of applications certainly didn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's maybe It's maybe only 1 or 2 a month that I think we're really seeing anyway.
We did have some interesting battles as well. The other sort of shed was to make sure they constitute their model. Their rules by the DGS and there was conflict between state rules and having the model rules for the shed and what that meant for the shed. And a local level conflicted directly with what being asked to get DGS. The shed was really doing that here and we can't really be bothered. So right from the outset,
Thanks, James. Ian.
I'm so glad Ryan asked about acts.
But I wonder if we or that it has all amalgamated. Change the name from men's sheds to just sheds or something, I don't know. So that's something that I think on the other hand, that has been habitat
Thanks. Oh, sorry. I might move on. We do have another question. Yeah.
Good question. I'm not sure that I have the answer. I know that only those people, I'm sure those that have options. And the subject which the job yeah. Have you been I don't think it has any safety. My own personal feeling would be that's not the goal. I think we know that Pizzati is no better than the two-way cluster of the lines that we that's a good opportunity.
I was actually wondering, probably both Belinda and Kirsten, whether in the research that you were doing, you did think any more about how some of that, what Belinda was calling intellectual capital, could be built through the networks and through those different relationships that they had. Obviously, it's not something I heard you specifically focus on, but it may have been something that came up because you did speak about the importance of networks and relationships as well. So I'm just wondering, perhaps Belinda, whether you came up with anything that, you know, ways of doing it.
Because I think, you know, when they fund programming or fund certain terms and conditions, I think the potential solution that is that a percentage, whatever that percentage is also funding just developing the organisation. So irrespective of the program, but you know, match with the kind of services ANZTSR provides, training within that, and then we broke this with training, and they said, oh yeah, we provide training, but it was training to report to us under our terms for our systems. And yet that's exactly what the CBO said, oh yeah, they provided training so that we can fill out the right terms in the right places. But it was such a narrow view of training, and when we explored beyond that, sort of going, so people should, but it's just, we just don't have time today. And I think that's a conversation that just needs to be retained from the very top to the very bottom, that this would just be a constant cycle of funding unless we start genuinely funding a little bit of capacity building for those organisations to be strong, dominant, and still do the good work.
Yeah, I think that's probably true across the board, and I'm wondering how that intersects with the idea that at the ACNC we come up against a little bit, which is this issue of administration costs and how evil they are, apparently.
But you know, that's I feel like that is not
I would probably say that's true as well, because the concerns come from public, yeah, rather than the sector themselves. Mm. Yeah. Mm.
Everybody's dancing and come to life together.
and I do have that is like
Mm, mm. That's right. That's right. I'm just wondering if whether that came out in anything that you were speaking about in terms of particular development of governance.
Well, I was just thinking about this. Really, and generally in my research, I've been with voluntary organisations. So the intellectual capital really be monetized as a financial cost of time. And I was just thinking that it's really good. To a certain extent, we're trying to identify through the project what makes private membership so we can pass that on to other memberships, and to try and distill some of that intellectual capital from the leaders and implementers. But also, I think that one of the challenges in this came out in the membership, but it's common in other voluntary associations is, you've got the same people in the sense of and they're going to build up so much knowledge about what's going on. And then when they go, they can sit, or we see them move to another organisation where they're taking that there. But is it lost from the original organisation? But also is it a good thing that's being spread throughout community to other associations? So I think it's not really something that I think is best in the voluntary. But I think it's a really interesting idea to think about that as in terms of capital, and as a particularly, I suppose, to maybe some of the more regional rural areas as a community capital.
Well, I do have to wrap us up, but that was an excellent conversation, and thank you so much, Kirsten and James and Belinda, for sharing your papers with us today.